The hidden tax of inflation. You know that inflation is a stealth tax that doesn't require legislation to work its destructive power on your finances. And in this episode, what we want to do is we want to talk about how you can battle the ravaging effects of inflation through financial wisdom, right? Through some financial strategies that can help you in this current environment. Later, I'll be joined by financial advisor Mike Mitchell. He'll be here to share 4 strategies that he even shares with his own clients who are battling this very hefty inflation today, right? We're standing right now as we look about a 7.5% official published year-over-year inflation increase, which means that many people are facing some really tough times as the income or the wage hikes have not kept up with the acceleration of consumer prices and producer prices. It's just simply getting out of control here in the United States and also abroad. Things aren't much better in other parts of the world, particularly in Europe, where they have been doing very similar things as far as printing a lot of new currency to deal with the current, overall economic slowdown that we faced from COVID-19. And now, as the economies are reopening and as economies are trying to get back to their old ways, all of this money that has been printed and is now out there is causing massive inflation in the prices at the store, energy prices, electricity prices, rent prices, housing prices. It really doesn't matter where you look. Prices everywhere are rising. Now, we've been talking about this on the Follow the Money podcast for a long time. In fact, those of you who have our book, Bankruptcy of Our Nation, which if you don't have a copy, you just need to run out and get one. You can get it from Amazon.com or our own website, followthemoney.com, or any bookstore that sells fine books. But the book is called Bankruptcy of Our Nation, the subtitle, Your Financial Survival Guide. And in this book, we talk about the cause of inflation here in the United States, the real cause, not the cause that they tell you in the media, right? But the actual real cause of inflation, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And then we also talk not just about the problem, but we spend a lot of time in this book talking about solutions, so things that you can do to improve your finances, to protect your finances, lots of strategies, lots of income ideas, lots of investing ideas, all in this book, Bankruptcy of Our Nation. But not only in the book have we talked about inflation and how to, shield yourself from its ravaging effects, we've also been talking on this podcast very recently about this topic. So you go back to December of 2020, episode number 380 was entitled The Coming Commodities Bull Market. Well, commodities now, of course, in 2022 are really revving up, right? If you look across the board, oil, soft commodities, things like wheat and soybeans, corn, many of these things are just going wild right now. So agricultural commodities in general, we've seen a big spike in. Then back in episode 389, which was back in May of 2021, we released a podcast episode entitled Inflation is Here. So that has been many, many months ago where we were telling you, look, this inflation issue is going to get worse and worse. We even did one about how gold was going to thrive amid this crisis back in May or June of last year. And then episode number 398, these are some episodes you might want to go back and listen to if you missed, but episode 398 was called Hard Asset Investing 101. That was back in September. So we were talking about how you could improve your overall asset portfolio, your investment portfolio, by including hard assets, right? We talked about some different ideas. And so now, as we're dealing with all of this, as we see all of this inflation surging, the question becomes, how can we protect ourselves from it? You really can't answer that question until you know what inflation really is. Now, as a guy with a background in economics, and having taught economics at the college level, I can tell you that there are many different theories about inflation. There is, and we won't go through all of them, but there's the demand pull theory, which we're not going to go into depth. But basically, it means that increasing demand for goods or services basically drives up prices. Right? That's the idea that demand creates the inflation. Then you also have the cost push theory, which means that if production costs go up, then companies pass that on to customers. Now, both of those are accurate. It is true that if you have too many people trying to buy one thing, it's going to cause the price to go up, right? Or if you have production prices or input prices going up, well, it's going to cause the end result price to be higher, right? So both of those are true in their own right. But the idea that inflation is born strictly from one of those two theories would be inaccurate, because the real source of inflation is simply monetary inflation, right? And it is not a theory that should go alongside all of these other theories. It is a reality. Now, let me explain to you why monetary inflation is the real problem as we sit here in 2022. It's the real problem. I probably don't have to tell you that a huge amount of money, a huge amount of currency, United States dollars here if you live in the United States, has been printed over the last few years, an incredible amount. I mean, just a couple of random facts here. The United States printed more money in June than the first 2 centuries after its founding in 1776, right? So you have 2 centuries of debt all packed into 1 month in 2020, right? And then, of course, Washington's spending is hitting new records. The federal government set an all-time record for the amount of money spent in the first month of a fiscal year, when it spent $521 billion in the month of October, right? That was the first month, I should say, of fiscal 2021. Now, many people seem to be okay with this. They're like, well, that's how you have to deal with an economic crisis. You've got to print more money, right? I mean, what else are you supposed to do? Well, the problem with that logic is that that's how the United States has been dealing with every single problem that it's had for decades, right? So instead of actually solving the problem, they simply print more money and kick the can down the road. Let's say that you had a $100 bill back in 1913, right? Well, that $100 bill would not buy you the same amount of stuff, by 1940. It would take $142 to buy what you could buy back in 1913 for $100, right? So just 1940 to 1913, that's a huge shift. How about in 1950? In 1950, it would take you $240 what you could buy for $100 back in 1913. Let's go forward even to let's just go to 2020. In 2020, it would take you $2,529 to buy what $100 could buy you in 1913. So what this means is that your purchasing power is constantly declining over time. And when the Federal Reserve prints more currency, it accelerates that decline of purchasing power in your finances. So ultimately what inflation is an increase in the monetary supply. Thinking about the idea of losing purchasing power, if I placed an apple and a US dollar on my kitchen table, and then I came back 10 years later, what do you think that I would find? Well, the apple would likely have completely disintegrated. And what would have happened to the US dollar? Well, it would still buy a dollar's worth of goods, right? No, just as we said, part of the value would have been lost due to what? Due to inflation. Inflation is a stealth tax, and the fact that it's hidden makes it even more dangerous to your wealth potential. Every time the Federal Reserve increases the money supply higher than the nation's overall productivity, it creates inflation. And inflation eats away at your savings, and it does so invisibly. The American economist Milton Friedman put it best when he said, quote, "Inflation is one form of taxation that can be imposed without legislation," unquote. So, every American faces, taxes. They face interest on the loans that they have. But on top of that, then they have, this inflation, which is this invisible tax that's like a hole in your pocket. So it's just constantly eroding the value of the currency that you transact in. And again, and this is not limited to just Americans. I'm talking to Americans specifically today about the hidden tax of inflation when it comes to what's happening here in the United States. But if you're outside of the United States, your own government is doing this as well. Governments are debauching their currencies and calling it good monetary policy, good economic policy. But what it's doing is it's destroying the value of your currency, and it's really decreasing your overall purchasing power over time. So it's not a good thing, and it's not a good way to handle economic problems in the 21st century. In fact, if we really want to talk about good policies here, the best thing to do would be to turn off the printing presses and actually deal with our problems. So you can't just keep kicking the can down the road over and over again as these policymakers think that they can do. It's going to blow up. It's going to blow up in their face. It's going to blow up in all of our faces because we all agree or somehow simultaneously, all seem to give our assent to this idea that the government can just keep printing money and that'll solve our problems. We can just paper over our problems by borrowing more, printing more, and never really dealing with underlying issues. So what needs to happen is the printing presses need to be turned off. And if you did that, that would require Washington to stop its frivolous spending. Now, when I say frivolous spending, some people automatically think, that's right, they're giving money to the poor. That's frivolous spending. I'm not thinking about that. That's actually not at the top of my list. I'm thinking more of that bloated $800 billion budget that's given to the Pentagon without any kind of accountability, right? I'm thinking about the interest on the federal debt that just keeps going up as interest rates go up. It's going to get even worse and worse. I'm thinking about a lot of other things. So I'm not really thinking about taking care of children and women and poor people, right? I don't think that's frivolous spending. I think what frivolous spending is spending money on bombs and war and all of the warfare state that we have built, the military industrial complex, and the insane amount of money that we're spending upon interest on the debts that it's actually going to go up as interest rates go higher. One thing that, the government can do is foster a way for healthcare costs to come down right here in the United States, for example. Healthcare price inflation is absolutely through the roof. College inflation is through the roof, right? So when you look at tuition and you look at healthcare costs and all of this, it's just driving, people bankrupt, literally, just to be able to afford, basic health care or to afford a basic college education. It's becoming extremely difficult for people to even buy a home because the entry-level homes are being scooped up by Wall Street, who are very starved for yield. They're looking for some kind of return. They can't get it, that yield in the, through interest or through the banks. So they're going to real estate and they're looking for ways to, and in the process, they're driving up the price of entry-level homes all across the country, making it very difficult for people who are cash-strapped, facing high tax burdens, and also facing this ravaging inflation and high debt loads to then be able to go out and then buy an entry-level home, a first home buyer's home. I mean, you just can't do it. It's getting very, very expensive. I like to invest in real estate. I have seen the prices, as all of us have, go sky high to where I've been priced out so many times from just buying a basic rental home, because there's so many people just bidding in this current market, right? So a lot of this has to do with very poor economic policies, and we are now paying the price for the poor economic policies that have been dealt to us here in the United States and abroad. And not only are the costs of all of these other things going up, but on top of that, there's something else known as bracket creep when it comes to state income taxes. So you may be in a situation, and many people are actually finding themselves in this situation, where your state tax bracket that you're in, you actually go up in, go to a higher tax bracket. This occurs whenever your income goes up because of inflation rather than really, higher real earnings. Just because you get a wage hike doesn't mean that you've really got ahead if the cost of everything else went up at the same time, right? So many states don't have a way to inflation, or they haven't set up a way to inflation index the state income tax brackets. And so not only are people facing higher grocery prices, higher home prices, higher rent prices, higher energy prices, but then they're getting a wage increase, a small, meager wage increase at work, And then they're finding themselves in a new state income tax bracket where they got to pay more taxes, even though they're not really making any more money, all things being equal, right? So it's a really bad deal for a lot of people here. This all reminds me of a recent video that we did for our members entitled "The Fed is Playing with Fire." And in this particular video, I talked about how the Fed is staring down a really big problem right now, as the media has kind of made us aware. After months of encouraging businesses and consumers to borrow their way out of a financial crisis with easy monetary policy, the Federal Reserve is now preparing to raise borrowing costs, right? So it has to raise interest rates. Now, what's interesting is that despite all of this inflation that we've been hearing about, inflation running 7.5% year over year for consumers, and producer prices, even higher than that. Inflation, the published inflation rate currently, at 40-year highs. But remember, just imagine if they weren't really printing the published rate, but they were actually printing the true inflation rate, how much higher it would really be, right? So now they have to raise interest rates, but they haven't done it yet. So here we are near the end of February 2022 as I record this episode, and the Federal Reserve has still not raised interest rates. Interest rates are at zero, right? And on top of that, the Federal Reserve is still buying government bonds, right, to the tune of billions of dollars every single month. So it's simply incredible that even in this current environment where the Fed's like, yeah, we're going to have to unwind this everything bubble, they're still pumping it up. They're still leaving rates at zero in this current environment. So it's got to raise interest rates, right? And that's why you've been seeing the stock market, partially why you've been seeing the stock market and many markets, crypto markets and other markets falling, because the threat of rising interest rates interest rates are a function of valuations in the stock market, especially like tech stocks. They use the 10-year yield as a function to determine the valuation. So when the 10-year yield goes up, well, the value of a high growth tech stock, for example, is going to go down just simply because the 10-year yield is a function of the valuation model. So you have, obviously a problem. You have corporate borrowing. Your corporate borrowing has surged more than $1.3 trillion since the start of 2020, right? The average credit rating of companies has been declining, according to Moody's, which is an early warning that some of them could run into problems with paying what they owe if debt service costs rise, which they're going to, of course. Then you also have many zombie companies out there in the United States, right? More than 600 publicly traded companies. They don't even generate enough cash flow to service their debt payments. And they could be very vulnerable as borrowing costs begin to move higher, right? Many new investors are actually investing in companies like this, which is even more of a disaster. Many of them are not only investing in these kind of zombie companies because, the stock market only goes up according to them, but then, many of them are facing insolvency. And yet there are investors who are piling into many of these, very poorly run companies. So you have a lot of corporate borrowing that's just going crazy. That's all going to have to be paid back. And interest rates are, of course, going higher. Then we mentioned consumer borrowing. That's been booming thanks to the Fed's easy money policies. So we've been seeing a big spike in credit card, student loan, HELOC, and mortgage debt, auto loan debt. All surging higher in this current environment. We've even begun to see that many people are using credit cards more than ever. In the past, for a period of time, because the government was handing out money to individuals, it was preventing some of the dependence upon credit. But now that money has dried up, now that the unemployment pay has mostly dried up for many people in most states, and then also the fact that many of the credits that were being sent out to people have also dried up. People are now turning back, many individuals and businesses are turning back to their credit cards to finance everyday stuff, right? And then, of course, we haven't even talked about the government borrowing money. They've been borrowing money like crazy, right? The federal spending last year was, trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars, right? Huge, massive $4 trillion annual deficit from last year. Just outrageous. The amount of spending that's going on. And the national debt standing over $30 trillion. There's no plan to pay that back. There's no plan. There's just no plan, right? So the Fed encouraged borrowing, and now it has to raise interest rates. It reminds me of a quote by Howard Marks, who is the co-founder of Oak Tree Capital Group. He said, there are negative aspects when you encourage people to borrow, but then later feel that you can't raise rates because so many people borrowed, right? It's something of a trap, Mr. Marks says. And I agree. Absolutely. The Fed has really kind of created a trap now where individuals who have borrowed to be able to handle this current situation or to take advantage of the low rates, now the Fed feels like it's backed into a corner. So why is the Fed not raising rates? Well, because it may feel like it can't quite yet, right? And the stock market is pulling back in this environment, right? So here's the deal. America, and many Western nations for that matter, have enormous financial problems that are not going away anytime soon. And these problems require solutions. Yet, unfortunately, our nation's leaders appear unwilling to take the political risks necessary to confront these problems. So it's safe to assume that these financial problems will have to inflict massive amounts of economic pain upon a largely unprepared American public before the nation's political leaders will lift a finger to solve them, right? We're talking about 7 out of 10 Americans today living paycheck to paycheck. Right? And if you believe that Washington will solve any of these crises before they begin to impact you and your community, you're sadly mistaken. As Winston Churchill once quipped, you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else.